It's a program that we collect. Volunteers collect a lot of trash during the spring or during the year, and then we gather this trash and we have plant trees depending on the number of pounds that we collect. So we're in the process of planting trees. We'll be doing that, the last of October up to the 1st of November this month. And we've got an elementary school picked out, and also a new North Carolina Museum of Art park. So if there's some volunteers still needed to participate in this, so just contact us to do that. Another program quickly is a program that we're very proud of, is the Farmers and Communities Managed Deer Program. Deer hunting is underway, and recently we've been awarded a $2,500 grant from the South River Electric Membership Corporation, and that would bring a total of about $4,500 that we were awarded for this program for the year. So we're really proud of that. Now, I wanted to move on to the program for this month. And this month's program, we have a guest speaker, Ron Sutherland. He's going to give a presentation on, conserving North Carolina's red wolf. And along with Ron, we're going to have Tim Gestwicki. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, which many of you know, I'm sure. But he's going to join the meeting, from time to time, and kind of piggyback off of Ron's presentation of what some of the work the Federation is doing to help with red wolf conservation as well. A little bit about Ron. He now serves as chief scientist for the conservation nonprofit group Wildlands Network. It's an organization he's been with since 2010. At Wildlands Network, Ron works to protect red wolves and other endangered species. He helps map out wildlife movement corridors across North America, and he uses science to try to protect animals from being run over on our highways. In addition, his education, in addition to his degree from NC State University, Ron has a master's from Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies at Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD from the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke University. Ron also has co-led the successful and award-winning campaign to save the 79,000-acre Hoffman Forest in eastern North Carolina from destruction. Now, a little bit about Tim. He's led North Carolina Wildlife Federation for more than 2 decades. He started as a canvasser for the organization in 1991, and he became the CEO in 2009. Now, Gestwicki has grown the Federation from a budget deficit organization to a multi-million-dollar one. Under his leadership, he has established more than 18 chapters in North Carolina. One of the programs, the Great Outdoors University, that he has been responsible for, has served over 27,000 youths a year. Other programs include restoring more than 30,000 acres of pollinator habitat, and more than 60,000 meals of ground venison per year have been provided to help feed the hungry in partnership with processors and community food banks. He is often seen testifying in front of elected officials advocating for wildlife conservation, or he's happily sitting in a duck blind. So with those introductions, I wanted to turn it over to Ron for his presentation. Ron, you take it away.
Hey, Chad, before you get going, this is Tim. Could I just say a couple words?
Sure.
Yeah, I really appreciate our chapter and you and the South Wake folks hosting this. We're in the era of COVID, and it's important that we continue to provide educational program, and so I appreciate you guys hosting this. I also want to give you a shout out for your work to help feed the hungry, especially during these difficult times. Your efforts with our deer donation program is just outstanding, and thank you for helping us with our Trees for Trash program as we try to continue to keep the plastics and debris out of our waterways and replant native vegetation. I want to just, along with Ron's bio, which is awesome, I want to let everybody know that Ron and I are good friends, and Ron helps us with elk and wildlife crossings and wildlife habitat connectivity. And I'm proud to say that in 2014, he was the winner of our Governor's Conservation Award as the Natural Resource Scientist of the Year. So Ron, thank you for presenting to our chapter and all your hard work, and look forward to your presentation, brother.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, no, that's a really great introduction, and I'm deeply honored. Not everybody that hears me speak invites me back to speak again, but it's great to be back to speak to this chapter and about the red wolf situation, and I'm really happy to be sharing the billing with my good friend Tim and the Wildlife Federation. You guys do amazing work, and just jump in, Tim, anytime here as I talk. And we've got other colleagues on the line too. I think Kim Wheeler from the Red Wolf Coalition and other folks. So welcome everybody, and I'm going to give my version, my 2 cents on what's going on with the red wolf and what we can do to help save this species. So I thought I would start with a very short video showing what it's supposed to be like. And so maybe the philosophy here is sort of lead with your positive vision. So this is what red wolves should look like. Hopefully you can see this. This is the milltail pack of red wolves at Alligator River in happier times, 2017, and that was at least 6 animals going by there. And just imagine for a second, if it was an option for people in the Southeast to go see a spectacle like that, a big pack of wolves running by in the mist. This is 7 o'clock in the morning at Alligator River. That's what we want to achieve, and we were there for parts of for this millennium already, and I think we can get back there. But right now we're in a bit of a darker place. So this is me. If you can't see me very well, and Ron Sutherland, Chief Scientist for Wildlands Network. And just a little bit about us. We're a nonprofit based in Utah, but I'm based in Durham and North Carolina, and we're dedicated to rewilding, reconnecting, and restoring nature across North America. And we have staff in Mexico and in the Pacific and on the borderlands and up and down the East Coast. And so we've got a pretty grand mission, but we believe in it, and we're trying our best to sort of knit things back together for the sake of biodiversity. So the red wolf, let's start in there. And the red wolf, as far as we know, was the original wolf of the Southeast. And we know there was a wolf in the Southeast because early explorers like John James Audubon and William Bartram saw wolves when they were here, exploring the sort of the untamed wilderness. Of course, there were natives here as well, and they knew about the wolves as well. And Audubon himself described the red wolf, and others kept seeing it. And it's been as far as we know, the red wolf is the species that's out there. But the trouble, though, and if you're familiar with the red wolf situation, you'll have known about this. For a few decades now, there's been some controversies about the nature of the red wolf and whether it exists as a possible hybrid of gray wolves and coyotes, or whether it's its own unique thing. And that issue has been studied quite a bit by all kinds of scientists, and you can review the different theories. This paper that I'm referencing here is a good one. I can send this paper to Chad and others who want to share it. But the most recently, though, the Congress asked the National Academy of Sciences in Engineering and Medicine to review the issue of the taxonomy of the red wolf and what it is and whether it's worth conserving. And they put together this really august panel of biologists and geneticists, and they came back with a conclusion that the red wolf was, in fact, unique enough to be considered its own species, Canis rufus. And so for the moment, that seems to be, that should be good enough for now, I think, and it's certainly good enough in my book that this red wolf is something that we need to be trying to protect. And one of the reasons, though, that the red wolf has had this controversy over its origins is because its origins have been largely obscured by the fact that we wiped the species out, mostly by about 100. Really, most of the Southeast lost the red wolves probably 200 years ago. and they were all gone from North Carolina, I think about 120 years ago, 1900 or so. So it's been a long time. And frustratingly, not very many pelts or skins, really no pelts or skins of red wolves or any wolves for that matter, survived from the southeast. They just didn't age well in our humid climate, I suppose. But people knew the wolves were still out there, and when the Fish and Wildlife Service started getting into endangered species conservation, even before the Endangered Species Act was passed, they took a strong interest in saving the red wolf. And they went out to look for it along the Gulf states. They'd heard it was along the Mississippi River and the floodplains there. And what they found was kind of tragic, is that the last few wolves they could find were only along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. So these red areas shown here. And to make it worse, it seemed like those wolves were hemmed in by coyotes, and that they were being hybridized out of existence by the more numerous coyotes. And they took the difficult decision to take those animals into captivity. Take the entire species into captivity, like they did with the California condor, and to try to save it. And so they brought into zoos. They only caught, I think, 17 animals that they thought were relatively pure red wolves, and of those, only 14 ended up breeding. So it was this huge loss of the species that used to cover, as far as we know, most of the East Coast and the Southeast. And luckily, the species bred fairly well in captivity from those 14 animals, and after being declared extinct in the wild in 1980, they were able to release it back into the wild in North Carolina in 1987. And why did they choose North Carolina? Well, we thought it was within the range of the red wolf, for one thing, but also because the East Coast, the Atlantic coast, at that point in the 80s, they didn't think had coyotes. And there was a new national wildlife refuge out here on you can see that, the tip of the Albemarle Peninsula, Alligator River, and they thought that would be the perfect place to try to put red wolves out there and give them a fighting chance to grow a population before the coyotes showed up. And that maybe turned out not to be the case because coyotes got there earlier. But they released the wolves at Alligator River, and by and large, the first, say, 30, 20, 25 years of the program were largely a success story. In fact, it was the first recovery of a wild population of an extinct population of large carnivores back into the wild that had ever been achieved anywhere in the world. And many other wildlife restoration projects have learned a great deal from the red wolf work. In fact, the gray wolf restoration work out in Yellowstone happened in '95, and that was 8 years after the red wolf introduction project. So the population grew fairly well, and it hit a high of about 150 animals in 2005, 2006. And things were going fairly well. And speaking of the coyotes showed up a little earlier, in part perhaps because some of the animals may have been brought in to help train fox hunting dogs, is one rumor I've heard, and they may have escaped because coyotes are in fact pretty wily and hard to keep in a pen. But anyways, coyotes showed up, and the Fish and Wildlife Service was worried about coyote hybridization, sort of in the mid to late '90s and early 2000s. And so it started some great coyote adaptive management programs where they were trying to mitigate the degree of hybridization between coyotes and red wolves. And they were sterilizing coyotes as placeholders, put them back out in the landscape. And those coyotes would hold their territories. And so those territories didn't just get immediately filled in. If you go out and shoot coyotes to try to control them, unfortunately, what people across the country have found is that new coyotes show up pretty quickly. So this placeholder idea was a neat one, especially in the area around where the red wolves were, and it seems to have worked. These papers came out not too long ago showing that the coyote hybridization issue was largely being mitigated pretty well. So again, success story. But then we had some political changes in North Carolina in 2012, and I'm not implying this is a partisan issue, but it gave some cover to some folks that I think had always had an interest in perhaps shedding themselves of the Red Wolf program. And there was some organized and wealthy opposition to the Red Wolf program that started as well. And these efforts led to the Fish and Wildlife Service sort of reading the tea winds and deciding that politically the Red Wolf had lost favor in North Carolina. And the agency responded in 2015 by stopping the releasing of red wolves from captivity. In fact, the last red wolves were released from captivity in 2014. It's been 6 years. So the last 6 years, no animals have come from the zoos and wildlife centers and gone back into captivity. And they also stopped the innovative coyote management that we were doing out there. And the net result of the opposition to the red wolf campaign that was going on and the Fish and Wildlife Service making these decisions, the wolf population has since 2012 has dropped like a stone. And it's just remarkable. We went from 150 animals and 100 animals down to now there's only believed to be about 20 animals left in the wild. And of those, only about, I think it's 8 or 9 still have functioning radio collars, and we know for sure they're still out there in the wild. So this animal is indubitably, one of the rarest. It's definitely, I think, the rarest canid in the world, and it's probably one of the rarest mammal species in the world. It's just on the verge of re-extinction, you could say, in the wild. So what have we done? And I say we, in a sort of collective sense. There's a lot of great groups who are doing red wolf conservation work. But at Wildlands Network, one of the things we've specialized in is trying to use science to address some of the issues with the red wolf, to try to bring it back from the brink. And the folks down there that have led the opposition to red wolves kind of spread this idea that red wolves are causing the greatest wildlife disaster in the history of North Carolina. And those of us who are familiar with various other wildlife disasters in the history of North Carolina may disagree with that at face value, but we're taking this as a hypothesis. And so we set out, we got a grant, and we set out a bunch of different camera traps. You can see that right here on this tree, one of our older Moultrie cameras that we had on trees. And we put 20 cameras out on Pocosin Lakes and Alligator River National Wildlife Refuges where the wolves are. And that was in 2015. And we've been monitoring cameras at those refuges ever since. We've gone through different cycles of cameras and trying to show, what's going on with the wildlife in areas where you have red wolves on the landscape and where you've had red wolves on the landscape for 30 years. And in the interest of full transparency, we've taken, I think, what's a kind of a remarkably unique approach of actually putting all of our camera trapping results on the internet. Basically, as soon as we have time to get them uploaded, we put the wildlife pictures up there. We don't share pictures of people or cars or that sort of thing. But if you want to see, 186,000 pictures of wildlife from the red wolf recovery area, you go to this link here, and here's just a few of those. And if you haven't been down there, I really encourage you to go to Pocosin Lakes or Alligator River. They have amazing populations of bears, including sort of what you might call world-class bears. Like these two here are some good examples. They have black bears down there that are male black bears that are easily 600 or 700 pounds, sometimes reaching 800 pounds. Just incredible animals to take a look at. Bobcats are extremely common down there. We see lots and lots of bobcats going by our cameras. We lots of wolves as well. So it's always a highlight when we look through our memory cards from our cameras to see the red wolves. And we also see lots and lots of deer. And so that should be the comforting thing for folks that are worried about the wolf impacts on deer populations, because the deer are out there. Every camera we put out, we see deer on public land and on private land. And we're working to analyze this data. We've been sort of in a crisis campaign mode for a few years now on the red wolf, and we've never stepped back to actually analyze the detection rates for the different cameras. But we're going to try to look at that and see if there's any real relationships between red wolf numbers and the numbers of deer we're seeing in these cameras. But one way of looking at it yourself, if you want to, is go to this link, and again, I can share this with Chad to share with the Federation. We took 3 years of camera trap photos from one of our cameras, camera 2 at Alligator River. It's right in the heart of the Milltail Pack. It's a place where red wolves have been since 1987, and so they've been on the landscape there for 30-something years. And you can watch 3 years worth of photos from one camera, all these animals going by in just about 15 minutes. So it's a good 15 minutes to spend. And it's just an incredible snapshot, an incredible glimpse into, what's really out there. And, you see the wolves, but you also see the deer going by at the same place as the wolves, and all these huge numbers of black bear and bobcats and everything else. So it's a really, really neat thing. And we shared that video intentionally with deer hunters in Eastern North Carolina using some Facebook advertising tools. So I'm really proud of that approach that we took, and got some interesting comments as a result. The fun thing about the camera trap project, one of the reasons I like it so much getting down there, is that folks that have been there know it's such an amazing place. And yesterday we were out at Alligator River, and we saw a pair of peregrine falcons and sitting up in a tree. And just were amazing birds. It was the first time I've actually seen those close enough to know for sure that's what they were. And then this morning, we're out at Alligator River, and we saw something. You see this road going in the background of this picture here. We saw something running towards us. We had just finished checking a camera, and they got closer and closer, like that scene from the Monty Python, the Holy Grail. And they, finally they were close enough to see, and it was this pair of deer, and the doe was running away from this drooling buck who was obviously in rut, and he was drooling and grunting as he ran, and they just about ran into us. And then the doe finally saw us and turned around and ran, and the buck looked at us as if we were a nuisance, and he turned around and ran back after her. So that was just a pretty remarkable wildlife sighting just this morning. And then we often see really neat things when we open the camera boxes, frogs and lizards and things. And today was the first day we actually got a snake, and it was a doozy. We found a scarlet king snake in one of our camera traps. This beautiful little guy here. So it's just a really wildlife rich place. And so I encourage anybody that ever hears a story about red wolves causing a wildlife disaster, go to Alligator River yourself and experience it firsthand. It may not be as many deer as you see in your suburban backyard in Wake County, but there's still plenty of deer down there, and they're doing just fine. One of the neat projects we're also doing on the science front is to look at quail and try to look at whether the quail populations at Alligator River might be explainable in part because we have the red wolves in the same landscape. And we've been seeing in these last 5 years we've been doing our field work down there, we always see quail at Alligator River. And part of that's habitat. It's great. The fields at the north end are great habitat for quail. But there's also this issue of is it possible that having the wolves in the landscape makes life more difficult and more dangerous for the mesopredators like raccoons and possums, who are the nest predators for quail? And if so, it could be that having this large carnivore on the landscape actually makes the quail's job easier in terms of raising their young, and makes their population growth rate go into the positive. So we're doing this summer. We started our project. We're doing quail surveys at all the sites where we have camera traps, and we're spreading out expanding our camera trapping work too. And we're hoping to combine those two data sets, the quail data and the camera data, to look at this three-way sort of food chain hypothesis. So stay tuned there. If we can show that red wolves are great for quail populations, that would, I think, be a boon to red wolf conservation across the Southeast. And that's the science. From a sort of the broader sort of advocacy perspective and lawsuits and things, here's a few of the stuff that I've been involved in. We certainly thought of petitions, and we came up with the idea back in 2016 of taking all the different petitions that were out there to save the red wolf, and combine them into one master petition and remove all the duplicate names. And we were able to deliver 500,000 unique names to the Fish and Wildlife Service saying, please save the red wolf. So that was pretty remarkable effort. And then we also held rallies, rally in Raleigh, which is hard to say, but also one down in Little Washington, North Carolina. And those were a big success, people marching to demand that the Fish and Wildlife Service save the red wolf. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the reason we were doing these rallies was that the Fish and Wildlife Service was asking for comments on this somewhat disastrous sounding plan to basically scale back and give up on the red wolf recovery, scale it back to just one county, Dare County, and just the federal land in Dare County, so just Alligator River and the bombing range there. And that, by the agency's own admission, that would only be enough territory for about 10 to 15 wolves, which is, no biologist thinks that is a self-sustaining population by any means. So they had these comment periods about that. In 2017, the environmental groups worked together and delivered 55,000 comments to the Fish and Wildlife Service. 99.8% of those were pro-red wolf. And we know that because we counted them personally, because we sort of stopped taking things at face value and when it comes to wolf conservation. And so we counted them. And then 2018, a similar comment period came up, and we sort of hit it even more out of the park. 108,000 comments, 99.9% of those were pro-red wolf. And in fact, only 30 anti-wolf comments were delivered to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Again, we counted them, and that's 0.0%. So the public, we've delivered the message, I think, that the public supports red wolf conservation. There's been a number of lawsuits, and I'm not the person to really summarize the lawsuits that have gone on because we haven't been that closely involved. But the Southern Environmental Law Center, Red Wolf Coalition, Defenders of Wildlife, Animal Welfare Institute, Center for Biological Diversity have all done some great work the last few years, filing lawsuits to try to force the Fish and Wildlife Service to do the right thing. And it's one of my observations, I guess, is that it seems to be easier to force the Fish and Wildlife Service to stop doing something than it is easier than to get them to start doing something positive for the wolf. So we've struggled a little bit on that front, but the lawsuits have been very successful. And then, another thing we've tried is sort of direct local outreach. And, it's something that took a while for conservation groups to get back to. I think there was a fair bit of this the Fish and Wildlife Service was doing back in the 80s and early 90s. And so I don't want to undersell that, but for a little while there was less local outreach, especially in terms of landowner stuff. And Kim Wheeler, I'm not overlooking your great work there, but some of the other groups, ourselves included, were sort of neglecting this. And so we were able to hire in 2018 a local young lady, Carly Creef, and she was from that area. Her family is deeply from that area, and she came on board to act as our local representative to work to do outreach to the landowners. And one of the first things that we did with the Red Wolf Coalition was host a couple of listening sessions in 2019, and we did one in Hyde County and we did one in Tyrrell County. And we invited people in for breakfast. We basically invited the entire counties. We sent flyers out to the entire county, which is possible down there because their counties are fairly lightly settled. And invited them to breakfast, and we served them breakfast, and we got them to share what they were thinking about the red wolf situation. And we certainly got an earful, but it has helped us clarify, what kind of issues we're up against and how we can best strategize things. And the other thing that we started doing in sort of early 2019 was we launched a landowner camera project, because we'd had these refuge cameras out at the refuges for 5 years, and we were trying to spread the results from that. But we realized that we really needed to engage the local landowners down there and in the science effort to look at the wildlife situation going on down there. And of course, a fair bit of landowners down there already have their own trail cameras and they're managing their deer populations pretty carefully. But for those that didn't, I think this is a great opportunity for them to get a camera, a nice high-end reconnaissance camera out on their property so we could see what was going on. And the hope was also that it would build credibility for our work by sort of showing them that we were honest brokers in terms of getting these cameras out there and putting the pictures up on our Flickr site and so forth. And so we now have, there's a whole set of 20-something private land cameras worth of pictures up on our Flickr site, and they're labeled as such. So, we've just hit a setback in our outreach work as Carly's moved on to search for some other opportunities. And so we're using that as a chance. The red wolf is kind of on the brink, and we're using the next few weeks to try to really come up with a new strategy for what we can do. But I continue to think that landowner outreach is really important down there. So what's next for red wolf conservation? We're really down to the wire, as I said. And if you look at this trend, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a wolf scientist to know that if this trend continues, we're going to run out of red wolves in just the next few years. 5 or less, I'd say, and maybe less. Especially, this is particularly true because no wild red wolves have been born since 2018. There have been no litters in 2019 or 2020. And for a species that in the wild usually lives only like 5 or 6 or 7 years, having two years with no reproduction at all in the wild, and these are captive animals here, that's just the end game, to use a Marvel comics reference. We're up against the wall when it comes to red wolf conservation. To their credit, the Fish and Wildlife Service is trying their best to work within the rules that have sort of been imposed on them from way up above in the Department of Interior and perhaps even above there. And so they were able to bring up one wolf from St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge last winter to try to set that wolf up as part of a pair with another wolf from Alligator River. And they put them together in a pen for a few weeks and then released them in the hopes that they would get at least one litter going this spring. And the wolves got along. They didn't kill each other, but they ended up going their separate ways when they were let go. It's like the pandemic. They got a little too close for comfort sitting in the pen together. So it didn't work. I think the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to try again. with that experiment this winter if they're able to. But while we wait for some better federal leadership at the top to see what kind of improvements can be made at the federal level, I do want to emphasize that it'd be great to see the state of North Carolina taking a stronger push in helping conserve the red wolf. And Florida provides an interesting example. It's not a perfect example because I wouldn't say that what's going on with the Florida panther is perfect by any means, but at least the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission has a Florida panther program where they are directly engaged with helping the Fish and Wildlife Service try to conserve the Florida panthers that are down there. And I would love to see the state of North Carolina doing something similar. There's been some good steps in that direction. There's certainly been steps in the opposite direction, but there's been some good steps in that direction. And the other thing I would like to see happen as soon as we can is to get, given the situation we're in with the red wolf and given how contentious it's been and controversial, I really think this is a candidate species for a really strong private land incentives program where we're going to be basically paying landowners to do the right thing when it comes to these super endangered species. And it's particularly species like the red wolf where there's some degree of controversy around them. And I think it could, in some ways, be patterned after like a deer hunting lease. A lot of the landowners down there have deer leases, and they get paid by deer hunters to come and hunt on their properties. There's no reason why the wealthiest government in the history of the world can't be out there helping, paying an equivalent amount to landowners down there to host these incredibly endangered red wolves, so the wolves can get their footing back under them. I would love to see a kind of a tiered system where you get a certain amount of money for allowing access to the Fish and Wildlife Service and saying you're going to tolerate the wolves, and then more money per acre, perhaps if you can show that you have wolves on your property with like GPS collar data or camera data and that kind of thing. And then sort of the maximum amount per acre if you can actually show that the wolves are raising pups on your property, because that's the kind of golden standard that we really need to be rewarding landowners down there if they're able to host breeding red wolves. And I think we missed some early opportunities to really reward some landowners. And that's coming back to haunt us now, and decades later, that we haven't been able to really show these landowners the appreciation they need. If they're hosting red wolves on behalf of the rest of us who clearly care based on those the petitions and the comment periods and everything else, we need to show them some love as well. And the other thing that needs to happen, the red wolf shouldn't just be North Carolina's responsibility. The Center for Biological Diversity came out with a nice report showing some of the other places around the Southeast where red wolves can be reintroduced. So refer you to that report. There's places, basically any large complex of public land, our national forests, for example, come to mind as potential reintroduction sites. But you're always going to have the private lands issue because none of the places in the Southeast are, Adirondack size, 6 million acres or something like that. We just don't have that. And so we need to have a private lands component to make the red wolf really work. And then sort of coming full circle, though, is the issue of what's going on the Gulf Coast. Because just the last year, it's come out that scientists, 2 different independent labs came out with different studies at the same time, and they didn't even know that the other was doing the work. But they basically were able to show that these wild canids down on the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana actually had very surprising amounts of red wolf DNA. And they're not pure red wolves, but they are, they've got like 40% red wolf DNA in some cases, and up to like 75, 80% red wolf DNA. And what this shows is that, to me, it's sort of remarkable that these animals have survived. And it shows 2 things. One is that the red wolves, we didn't catch them all back in the 70s. And that's not too surprising, given how hard it is to track down wild animals in such a large, remote area. And then the second thing is just that it's this message of hope, and perhaps a message of humility, that red wolf genes, at least, and this red wolf DNA, instead of what we thought would happen, which is that the coyotes were going to swamp these animals and make them disappear, instead they were able to survive on their own in the Gulf Coast for what's now close to 40, 50 years with basically no help and no management, nothing but benign neglect, and that's perhaps better than what we've given the red wolf in recent years. It's certainly not been benign neglect. There's been some very active persecution. So these animals have been sort of incognito down there. Now their secret's out, and the question is, how are we going to work with the Gulf Coast red wolf hybrids that are out there? The neat thing is they have ghost DNA. They have DNA that is not found in the captive population of red wolves, and they have DNA that's not in the wild population in North Carolina, but it's red wolf DNA that was lost. And that's not surprising when you only get 14 animals. You grab 14 animals out of the population that were left. It's not surprising we lost a fair bit of genetic diversity. And hopefully we can figure out a way of getting that genetic diversity into the captive population. And then we also need to figure out what to do with these animals on the Gulf Coast, and sort of how not to screw it up and make things worse for them. Habitat protection is obviously key down there. They need to have their habitat protected. And so speaking of the captive population, it continues to do pretty well, I'd say. I think the folks at the zoos take their jobs very seriously, and they're doing a great job managing the captive population, the species survival program, as it's known. I think there's 40 something zoos around the country that are now managing a total of something like 250 animals in captivity. The good news is that the red wolf does breed fairly well in captivity, and so that's good. The bad news is they're not being released into the wild, and they haven't been. And in fact, what's the result of that is actually that the zoos have had to slow down breeding red wolves because they've run out of pen space, because there's nowhere to put the wolves, and they live in captivity. They live a lot longer than they do in the wild, and so you sort of run out of places to put these animals. So if we could get back to releasing animals from captivity into the wild, then the zoos could actually elevate the level of breeding. But they are actively trying to find new facilities, and existing facilities like the North Carolina Zoo are expanding the level of breeding pens that they have so they can host more wolves. And I think the hope is to get to something like 400 wolves in captivity, because that would help maintain the genetic diversity in the captive population. But really, from my perspective, the captive population has to be viewed as serving the needs of restoring this animal to the wild. And so I think that's the urgent priority. So conclusions, we're really up against the wall when it comes to red wolf conservation. It's hard to put a rosy sheen on a situation where you've only got 20 animals left in the wild after about 5 years, 6 years of just rampant slaughter of this noble animal down there. And so, if we can't get that under control, then the species is going to go extinct in the wild for the second time, and perhaps the final time, because we haven't seen any evidence right now that the Fish and Wildlife Service is actually going to start a new program. We certainly hope they will start a new program somewhere else. But if the North Carolina population goes extinct, it's going to be really harder to sell that to some other state and say, hey, even though things didn't go right in North Carolina, we'd love for you to host some red wolves. So that's why I put so much weight on conserving the red wolf in North Carolina, so that it doesn't become this ghost species. And I want more people, in North Carolina and around the Southeast, and even people coming in internationally, to be able to have the chances I've had to see this animal in the wild and hear the animal howling in the wild. It's just a remarkable species. It brings the wild to the Southeast, having the red wolf out there. And I think other people really need to have that experience. And the wolf deserves a chance to live in the wild on its own, just for its own sake. It's just a beautiful, noble animal. And we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the rest of the biodiversity out there to maintain this top carnivore on the landscape. So there is hope. There's plenty of hope in this situation, because not only from those Gulf Coast animals that show that red wolves can do okay even in the face of coyotes, even with no management. I mean, that's pretty exciting. But there's also hope because we've already shown that we can grow a red wolf population in some place like eastern North Carolina, because it worked. We grew the population up just fine. So what we have to do is we have to restart the releasing animals from captivity to rescue the North Carolina population sort of immediately, because that's the easiest way to save the species right now from going extinct in the wild, is get more animals out there. And we also have to start working much, much better with private landowners and hunters and other folks down there to address their concerns. And we're going to keep doing that work. Wildlands Network, and with our great partners down there, trying to address people's fears, people's concerns about the wolf, because by and large, from what I can tell, that they're largely based on mythologies that have been intentionally spread by people that wanted to get this wolf out of the way. And ultimately, as I said before, I think it's time we start rewarding the people that live in areas where we're hoping to restore an animal like the red wolf. We need to reward them for doing the right thing. So with that, I will stop there and turn things back over. But thank you very much.
All right, Ron. This is Tim, and you teed me up perfectly. First of all, appreciate your efforts and certainly the data you provided. I'm just going to talk a few minutes about the Wildlife Federation's work over the years on red wolf, and then talk about private landowners and education, of which, again, Ron's data and camera traps are so crucial to providing actual data. We began in '87 by funding some of the interns that actually were part of the red wolf reintroduction program. And actually one of our current biologists was part of that program back in the day and has now come back to join the Wildlife Federation. We're going to talk about prey and habitat, and the program was actually introduced in two places in North Carolina, the Great Smoky Mountains, as well as Eastern North Carolina. Interesting enough, we're blessed both on the coast and the mountains with these wonderful, vast public land areas. It did not work in the mountains, primarily due to lack of prey. And so that leads me right in to talk about our Prey for the Pack program in conjunction with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is that private landowner incentive program to build relationships with the private landowners and provide incentive funding for establishing habitat for prey. And the red wolf eats numerous species, but we're talking about raccoons and rabbits and some deer. And so creating that early succession habitat and building those relationships, giving money, cost share money to private landowners within that red wolf range. Again, Ron mentioned this, the wolves know no boundaries, and they'll come off alligator or precocin. And when they get onto private land, we really have to have that public-private cohesive habitat and realization that we need both. And so this is a new foray into trying to build relationships with private landowners, providing that cost incentive funding for habitat restoration, habitat enhancement on the properties. And we're very excited to see how this can work and start to rebuild some of those relationships between the public government agencies and private landowners. And I think, again, Ron's information is very important. I'm especially interested in the outcome of the quail nexus. That could be a huge game changer. The other part is education. And I really don't know in my 30 years at the Wildlife Federation how many people even in North Carolina know we have red wolves and really the last remaining red wolves on the planet. And so we have staffed a staff member down at the Fish and Wildlife Center in a cooperative agreement, and built upon the work that Kim had done so well at the Red Wolf Center, and reopened the Red Wolf Center and the Visitor Center, and providing educational programs. And once we get better out of COVID, those will continue again. I think it's really important that people have the chance to go and see some of the captive red wolves, learn about red wolves, and then even get to go out on the precocin and take tours to do howlings, and as Ron mentioned, see the other the snow geese, the tundra swans, the black bear. In addition, we're raising money and working towards providing some live streaming night and daytime cams that will be placed at the red wolf pen, so that we can get a wider audience and people can actually watch the red wolves in their large dens, and try to bring more attention again to the fact that red wolves are on the landscape. These are the issues they're facing, and maybe get more towards the solutions for this carnivore on the landscape. So there's a combination. Ron touched about some of the legal maneuvers other folks are doing. Ron talked about the great data work, and we're also doing some camera trap work in conjunction with the Wildlife Resource Commission on 6 miles of Highway 64, where 2 red wolf underpasses were built into those roads during the reintroduction program, so that those we can see what wildlife are using it, and we can make sure that the fences are in good repair or needing repair in case tree falls on them, or any wildlife could get under it. So there's the species needs a lot of help, and there's a lot of tools to work towards that. And I just wanted to impart the pray for the pack. So if anybody in this call knows any landowners in that 5-county region that are in the red wolf territory, we'd certainly like to send them the information about pray for the pack so that they could apply to see if they would be eligible. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chad and take any questions, me and Ron.
Thank you, Tim and Ron. Our questions, we have a few. The first one is from John. He's asking if the National Zoo still has red wolves.
I don't know if the National Zoo does. I know the North Carolina Zoo does. I know the Western North Carolina Zoo does up in Asheville. There's 200 different facilities across the state where they're raising them, Ron? I think you're on mute, Ron.
Ron, you're on mute.
Sorry. So it looks like the National Zoo doesn't have red wolves. There's about 40 other places around the country that do have red wolves. But maybe the National Zoo, maybe the Smithsonian site out there at Front Royal could be convinced to add some red wolves to their program.
Okay. Next question is from Cat House in Union County. What does the North Carolina Wildlife Federation do to help deer?
Yeah, I answered that one in the chat, but I'll reiterate it for everybody. Back in the 40s, we encouraged and worked with the WRC and in the 50s to reintroduce white-tailed deer. It's hard to believe that was a species of very few left in North Carolina, and now they're certainly everywhere and doing very healthy. We support habitat protection and connectivity. We've been really involved in chronic wasting disease and working against these deer farms and deer pens, which are incubators for this prion that is devastating to elk and deer. And then certainly, deer management is important. And I applaud South Wake Conservationists and a lot of our chapters for participating in our deer donation program that allows hunters to donate their deer, and we pay for the process, and then they're ground up in venison and given through shelters and crisis and food pantries. And I think that's a very important thing. So, yep.
Okay, next question from John is, what other endangered species does Wildlands Network work with?
That's a good question. We are active trying to help save the Mexican gray wolf and the jaguar. We have our office in Mexico and also in the borderlands. And so we have some folks that are working on those. Let's see. The elk are not necessarily endangered, but they're coming back in North Carolina after being reintroduced. And we are working with the Wildlife Federation and National Parks Conservation Association and some other partners to try to smooth the way for elk populations to expand in Western North Carolina without causing endless car crashes. So we're looking at how to get elk across busy highways like I-40 next to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So that's a fun project. Out in the Pacific Northwest, we're active out there trying to push for recovery of gray wolves in Washington and in Oregon. And we're enthusiastic as well about grizzly bear recovery, like in North Cascades National Park, which keeps getting punted further down the road, but we hope to see that someday.
Great, great. Thank you. Here's another question. It's from Brenda. She wants to know how we can reduce the number of animals hit by cars.
I answered that one in the chat too briefly, but I think that, you know, there's a million animals killed daily on roads, and the reality is we are a fast-growing state, fast-growing country. 4 million miles of roadways. That's one way, so 2-lane, 4-lane, fragmented habitats. So a lot of work on wildlife corridors and connecting these habitats so there is safe passage, and that's what Ron and his group work a lot on with us in our National Wildlife Federation. And then, as Ron mentioned, this really important idea of underpass overpasses, and this pretty exhaustive program that Ron and we are involved with collaring these elk and other species to see where they're most likely traveling, and then trying to work through DOT and figure out if we can include wildlife overpasses, underpasses, and bridge replacements and future highway designs. And it's a big undertaking, but the reality is for both vehicular drivers, the safety, and then of course the loss of elk and black bear and red wolves on the roads is crucial to doing this better planning and infrastructure as we continue to build out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the good news, the bad news is that things like deer and raccoons are so spread out that it's going to be hard to fully prevent them from getting on the highway. But the good news is places where we can install wildlife road crossings and can install fences, we can actually guide animals to these places, and the science shows that they can be really effective at preventing roadkill. And so at key places around the country, we think we can really mitigate wildlife road mortality. So, and at the federal level, we've actually been working with the National Wildlife Federation and other groups to pass national wildlife corridor legislation. So we're trying to get that passed, and we also are trying to inject wildlife crossing funding into the transportation bills that they actually got. The bills are very close to being passed in the Senate and the House, and both versions include something like $250 million for building wildlife crossings around the country. And so if we could get those transportation infrastructure projects going, that would give us a huge incentive, or a huge impetus to get these projects going. And so that's one of the reasons we're doing the science we're doing, is to try to identify where these crossings really need to be.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question from John, and it's what are the bases of opposition to the Red Wolf program? And I'd like to add on to that is what specifically is the private landowners being harmed by having the Red Wolf?
Part of me wants to say I wish I knew, but the basis of opposition is two things, I'd say. One thing is there's a fair number of people that are sort of convinced that the red wolf is somehow illegitimate and that it shouldn't be in North Carolina. And, I think we can argue against that pretty well. And then there's also there's this theory that's out there that red wolves are either destroying the wildlife themselves, or they're getting in the way of people controlling coyotes, and coyotes are destroying the wildlife. And what I, rather than sort of answer that question, I'd sort of encourage folks to take a look at our camera trap data, go down there yourself and see it for yourself firsthand. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's the opposite of a wildlife disaster down there. But the problem is communicating that to folks that have had people they trust sort of give them this message that there's a wildlife disaster going on.
Right. Okay, the next question is from Cameron. Are all of the remaining wildlife population, or wait a minute, are all of the remaining wildlife population collared? I think he means the red wolf wildlife population collared.
Yeah, it's about half as far as we know. About 9 out of 20, and the 20 part is a rough guess of how many wolves are left out there. It could be less. And there's a few coyotes that are collared as well, and we certainly hope people will avoid shooting basically any canid down there that has a collar on it at this point. And I think the Wildlife Federation has helped push the Fish and Wildlife Service towards putting orange collars on the wolves, and I maybe saw some of those in my slideshow. Bright orange collars that would make them easier to identify. So that's I think that's a good strategy. The challenge is that young wolves that are coyote sized, they usually don't get caught to put collars on until they're about 1 year old. And so they're always going to be vulnerable and looking like an uncollared sort of coyote sized animal. So it's tricky.
Yeah, Ron's right. I mean, it's almost really difficult to distinguish a coyote and a red wolf, especially from long distance if you're coyote hunting or trying to deal with coyote management. So the idea was to collar them with blaze orange and with the hopes and ideas that there would be no excuses for shooting them in that regard. They're collared, but we'll see how it plays out.
Okay. Here's a question from Monty. What specific rules are being imposed on the U.S. Field and Fish and Wildlife Service from the Department of Interior or higher that prevent them from doing what they should do to conserve this ecologically important species?
Well, as far as we know, and it's hard to get a very straight answer about who is exactly imposing these restrictions, but what we've heard is that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been told that they don't have the authority anymore to release wolves from captivity because the original the Federal Register rulings about the red wolf that have been sort of promulgated really they're from the 80s and early 90s. There hasn't been a new Federal Register sort of update on the red wolf situation since I think about 1995, at least dealing with the issue of adding more wolves. And we have pushed back. We had our own legal analysis conducted. The Duke Environmental Law Center conducted an analysis for us about whether the Fish and Wildlife Service had the authority to keep releasing red wolves. And their answer was yes, that clearly the Fish and Wildlife Service is obligated by their enabling legislation to conserve endangered species. By the Endangered Species Act requires that the Fish and Wildlife Service do what they need to do to save these species in the wild. And so we really think that they do have the authority to keep releasing wolves. And the coyote management issues, I think, are something they have to work out internally, but also in cooperation with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission.
Okay. Next one is from Jay Christina. Do you have any insight on the previous/current efforts of the North Carolina State's red wolf breeding program?
That's a good one. That's a good question. I think what they might be referring to, NC State's College of Veterinary Medicine has been closely involved in the red wolf recovery program, I think, from the beginning. And so there's been folks from NC State that have been on the recovery teams for red wolves for quite some time. And they've done a lot of interesting research into sort of breeding red wolves and so forth. But that's my guess as to what they might be asking about. I don't think, actually the one interesting anecdote, NC State's, color is red and their mascot is the wolf. And so you would think that NC State would be super active. And I'm an NC State grad, I should say. But Arkansas State recently renamed themselves the Red Wolves. And back in sometime in this last decade or so. And they have just gone sort of wild for red wolves over there. It helps they don't have any red wolves. And so there's no controversy there, but they've actually set up a captive breeding site on their campus. At least last I heard, that's what they were going to do is start breeding red wolves on Arkansas State's campus. And there's pictures of red wolves all over the place over there. So pretty remarkable enthusiasm, and I hope we can match it here at NC State.
Good. The next one is from Bill. He's asking, could you comment on the defunct red wolf program in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park?
Yeah. Go ahead, Tim.
I think I answered that a little bit earlier when we talked about it primarily through both road mortality, but also through lack of prey. That program was abandoned completely in the western part of the state. I mean, that's the answer I have. Ron, do you have anything further to that? That's about it.
Yeah, the two other things I've heard. Well, one thing I heard is that they, given the technology they had in the 90s, it was actually pretty hard for them to find the litters of pups with the radio collaring, because the collar data sort of collar signal bounces off the mountains, and they had trouble finding the animals again, basically, once they're out there. And so they couldn't do as good of a job of vaccinating animals against diseases. And they were, there weren't wolves out there when they put them out there, but there were various wild and sort of semi-wild, like feral dogs and things that have mange and have distemper and so forth. And red wolves seem to be sensitive to that, in part because the red wolf population started so small. And the other challenge was, again, this idea that they could start a red wolf program, and then they could somehow contain it within the national park. And what the wolves in the national park figured out is that yes, like Cades Cove is pretty awesome, but if you leave Cades Cove, you're in remarkable old growth forest, but it's not great deer habitat. But look down in that valley of private land outside the park, that's where the deer are. So they're going to make a beeline for that, and so there's this prey gradient that leads out of the park, and the wolves are going to follow it because they don't know any better. And so that's the challenge. You need, even with a 500,000 acre national park, you need more space for these animals to go. I would love to see them try again in the mountains, but if they do, they need to involve the national forests. It needs to be not just the national park, but the entire national forest complex in western North Carolina is seen as the recovery area, because that's a lot of acreage, and some of that is being managed for wildlife and and early successional habitat and deer and things. And then B, they have to involve private landowners and get support there. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this one there's several here that complimented both you guys on your presentation, but I'll go on down. It says, this is from Betty. She's asking, what's the next step in creating a rewarding landowners program?
The answer is money. A big pool of money. A big ongoing sustained pool of money, because you can't start and stop that, because then you've lost all the goodwill. So it would take fairly significant money, in my opinion.
No, I think I would echo what Tim said. I think we need Congress to get the back of the Fish and Wildlife Service, in cooperation with a lot, some private donors as well, I think, to really fund this and to do it in a sustainable way, so that people know that the funding is going to be out there for 10 years at least. So.
Yeah. And just to piggyback that, our national wildlife refuges and our public lands are sorely underfunded by the federal government. Sorely. Not just for this program, for everything. I mean, you've got 2, I think, personnel left at Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge to manage 100,000 acres. I mean, so the reality is of an influx of money for managing maintenance. How the heck are you going to manage 100,000 acres for wildlife habitat with 2 personnel? So sore underfunding for our public lands managers.
So you're thinking that educating them, you've educated them all you can educate them. Does that say the private landowners?
Oh, no. I would never say that. No. Education never stops. No, education and new knowledge, new data, new communication tools. No, education never stops. Can never stop. That can never be the answer. I think new ways of communicating, and I think the state agency and the federal agency are communicating very well these days on this. I think the federal agency has local folks have said where they've made some mistakes in working with the private landowner. So communication is crucial, and then it's a matter of good faith showing. And we hope that Pray for the Pack is one entry point into that. And so no, we're dead without education.
Okay, good. This one is from Cat House. She asks, can red and gray wolves coexist, or would they crossbreed?
That's a good question, and I think the short answer is we don't know for sure. I think there's pretty good reason to think that they would be able to breed together, because most canids can breed together, even things that are, quite disparate in size and so forth. Dogs are the best example. That various dog breeds that are remarkably different from each other can still crossbreed. Canids just don't have the same sort of reproductive barriers that other types of species have, so they're more just sort of local adaptations. And so the best we know would have come from Texas, where you would have had the border of sort of the Mexican gray wolf population, sort of southwestern gray wolves, and also red wolves were there, and also coyotes. And there was some studies in that area showing that there was kind of this a lot of hybridization going on, I think, out there. But there still were the animals looked unique from each other, I think. And then from the sort of southeastern Canada, the Ontario area, the Algonquin Provincial Park up there is basically a national park size park. And up there they have something called the eastern wolf. And a fair bit of people think that the eastern wolf and the red wolf are basically slices off the same tree in terms of the Algonquin wolf was from the north, and it was this sort of small deer-eating wolf of the north, and then the red wolf was from the south, and there perhaps once was continuity between those, and we lost that when the middle part was settled. But those animals, I think there's evidence that they have crossbred, some with larger gray wolves, and have that larger gray wolf DNA in there, but don't necessarily quote me on that. But there's evidence of gene flow up there, and the wolves in the Midwest, actually the gray wolves in the Midwest, I think also show evidence that they have some DNA from the eastern wolf that they call it, and also the sort of the more traditional sort of Rocky Mountain gray wolves. So it's the story of canid genetics is a truly complicated one, and it's sort of been, in some ways it's a beautiful thing, because it illustrates, it's a great introduction to how interesting our natural world really is, when we're finally being able to look under the hood with modern sort of DNA science and genotyping entire species. And what we're finding is the real world is really, really interesting, and it's also really, really complicated. And so just keep that in mind when you learn these things about these different species. Some of the simple things we learned in biology class don't hold up very well when you start looking at the real world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. One of the last questions we have is from Jerry. He's asking, what has been the support of the North Carolina congressional delegation on the red wolf issue? Supportive or not?
I'll lead off that, because I think back in the day, people were supportive, except for the now deceased Senator Jesse Helms, who claimed that the red wolf was terrorizing the women and children of Eastern North Carolina. But aside from that, during the reintroduction program, I think it was fairly supportive. And then you had the influx of coyotes, and then the private-public coexistence manners, and how do you deal with coyotes, and the ability to coyote management. And I think support has waned in it. I think Walter Jones, the now deceased Walter Jones, was fairly supportive of the red wolves, and that's his region. And Congressman Butterfield, that's the other congressman's region. They've been fairly supportive, but by and large, I think congressional support has waned, to say the least. Is that your take, Ron?
Yeah, I mean, without naming any more names in the election season, we really appreciated Jones's support, and we actually went up there to meet with his staff in DC a couple of years ago, and were surprised. He came out and he met with us for an hour to talk about red wolves, and so sort of he was a friend of the wildlife in his district, and we appreciated that. But there's been, that as far as we can tell, that when Congress mandated that the National Academy go and study the red wolf to see if it was a legitimate species, we're pretty sure that was actually an attempt to undermine the red wolf. And the people that sponsored that legislation were actually trying to show that the red wolf was not, in fact, because they had heard from certain folks that the red wolf wasn't legitimate, and so they were hoping to sort of force the Fish and Wildlife Service out of the red wolf game. And in fact, the opposite occurred. So that's pretty gratifying.
That's all. That's all the written questions. But I have a question. Recently, I read in the news about a federal judge make a ruling, against the Fish and Wildlife Service about that they must comply with the Endangered Species Act. Are you aware of that? That's just came out in the last 2 or 3 days.
I am, and I'm sure Ron is too. We follow this. That was a settlement agreement, and says the Fish and Wildlife Service has to go back and provide a revised red wolf recovery plan by 2023. So, if you look at that, you're looking at another 3 years of no action. So that's my legal reading of it as a non-lawyer. Ron, is that about what you took away from it? I think Ron's frozen, so we'll assume that Ron concurs with me in that regard. Ron is a biologist, not a lawyer either, but my reading is that's what that meant. Ron doesn't seem to, we might have lost Ron, but I think this goes back to a couple of things. Data and science. What does data and science drive us? Should be always the way we do everything. The management issues between public lands and private landowners, those dynamics. Again, how you manage different species, including the coyote, which is a non-native species. And then what is the will for conservation from the powers of the purse to support this reintroduction program? Because as Ron mentioned, the plan originally called for 3 other locations around the country, but I would find it hard to believe that if it can't be solved in North Carolina, that other sites would jump up and down for it. But that's just my personal opinion. So a lot of work, a lot of education, a lot of awareness building. There he is. Ron, I had kicked it over to you just for your non-lawyer take on that settlement. Your read was the same as mine.
Sorry, my internet just died. What was your read?
My read was, the settlement said to 2023 they got to have a new recovery plan by 2023. So
I think that's right. It's good to have some sort of firm date, because we've noticed a certain trend towards kicking things to the next year. They announce they're going to do something, and then they postpone it, and so it's good, but really we need something to happen before 2023 if this species is going to survive in the wild.
Right.
Okay, well, that's looks like that's all of our questions, and we really appreciate the information. We've had a lot of compliments on how well the presentation was, and it was a great presentation. I'm sure we're a lot more knowledgeable about red wolf recovery now. So are there any final notes from Madison or Tara?
No, thank you, Chad. I'm good. What about you, Tara?
I'm good as well. Thanks everyone for joining. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, folks. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Ron. Good to see you. Everybody be safe and healthy. Take care of each other.
Don't forget to
Great
vote.
job. Yes.
Yeah,
Great job.
please do vote.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.